There were no answers to be found in Port de Lef. The three companions went through the village and found the same signs of sudden departure that they had seen at the border post. There was evidence of some hasty packing, but in the majority of houses, most of the occupants' positions were still in place. Everything spoke of a population that had departed in a hurry, taking what they could carry on their backs and little more. Tools, utensils, clothes, furniture, and other personal goods had been left behind, but they could find no clue as to where the people of Peterborough had gone, or why they had departed. As it began to grow dark, Gillen finally called an end to the search. They turned to the Raidhar's house, where they unsaddled the horses and rubbed them down in the shelter of the small porch at the front of the building. They spent an uneasy night in the house. At least Will did, and he assumed Horace was as uncomfortable as he was. Gillen, for his part, seemed relatively unperturbed, throwing himself into his cloak and falling instantly asleep when Will relieved him after his first watch. But Gillen's manner was more subdued than normal, and Will guessed that the ranger was more concerned by this baffling turn of events than he was letting on. As he stood his watch, Will was amazed at how much noise a house could make. Doors creaked, floors groaned, the ceiling seemed to sigh with every breath of wind outside, and the village itself seemed full of loose items that would bang and clatter as well, bringing Will to a nervous, wide-eyed attention as he sat by the unglazed window in the front room of the house, the wooden shutters hooked back to keep them secure. The moon seemed keen to join in on this subterfuge as well, soaring high above the village and casting deep pools of shadow between the houses of the village, shadows that seemed to move slightly when you caught sight of them out of the corner of your eye, then stopped as soon as you stared directly at them. More movement came as clouds flew across the face of the moon, alternately causing the main square to be illuminated, then plunged into sudden darkness. Just after midnight, as Gillen has predicted, a steady rain set in, and the other noises were joined by the gurgle of running water and the splash, splash, splash of drops falling off eaves and into puddles below. Will woke Horace to take over the watch at around 2 in the morning. He piled up a stack of cushions and bed covers on the floor of the main room, wrapped his cloak around him, and lay down. Oh, wow, we just closed the book. That was kind of sad. Then he lay awake for another hour and a half, listening to the creaks, the groans, the gurgle, and the splashes, wondering whether Horace had dropped off to sleep and whether even now some unseen horror was creeping up on the house, bloodthirsty and unstoppable. He was still worrying about it when he finally fell asleep. They were on the road early the following morning. The rain had stopped just before dawn, and Gillen was keen to press on to Gwentalworth, the first large town on their route, and find some answers to the puzzle that they had found so far in Caltica. They had a quick, cold breakfast, washed down with icy water from the village well, then saddled up and rode out. They wound down the stony path from the village, taking their time on the uneven surface, but when they hit the main road once more, they urged their horses into a canter. They held the canter for 20 minutes, then rested the horses by riding at a walk for the next 20. They maintained that alternating steady pattern through the morning. They ate a quick meal in the middle of the day, then rode on. This was the principal mining area of Caltica, and they passed at least a dozen coal or iron mines, large bleak holes cut into the sides of hills and mountains, surrounded by timber, shoring and stone buildings. Nowhere, however, did they see any sign of life. It was as if the inhabitants of Celtica had simply vanished from the face of the earth. They may have deserted their border post and even their villages, Gillen muttered once almost to himself, but I've never yet met a Celt who would desert a mine while there was an 1 ounce of metal still to be torn from it. Eventually, in mid-afternoon, they came over a crest, and there in a valley dropping away from them were the neat rows of stone roofs that formed Gwen Township. A small spire in the center of the town marked a temple. The Celts had their own unique religion, which had to do with the gods of fire and iron. A larger tower formed the main defensive position for the town. They were too far away to make out whether there might be any movement of people in the streets, but as before there was no sign of smoke from the chimneys, and even more significantly, according to Gillen, no noise. Noise? Harris asked. What kind of noise? Banging, hammering, clanking, Gillen answered him briefly. Remember, the Celts don't just mine iron ore, they work the iron as well. With the breeze blowing from the southwest as it was, we should be able to hear the forges at work, even from this distance. Well, let's go see them, Will said, and began to urge Tug forward. Gillen, however, put up a hand to restrain him. I think perhaps I might go on ahead alone, he said slowly, his eyes never leaving the town and the valley below them. Will looked at him puzzled. Alone? He asked, and Gillen nodded. You noted yesterday that we were making ourselves pretty obvious when we rode into Port de Leth. Perhaps it's time we became a little more circumspect. Something is going on, and I'd like to know what it is. Will had to agree that it made good sense for Gillen to go on alone. After all, he was possibly the best unseen mover in the Rangers' Corps, and Rangers were the best unseen movers in the kingdom. Gillen motioned for them to fall back from the crest they were standing on, and down the other side to a spot where a small gully formed a sheltered campsite out of the wind. Set up a camp here, he told them. No fires. We'll have to stay with cold rations until we know what's going on. I should be back sometime after dark. And with that he wheeled Blaze and trotted him back over the crest and down the road towards Gwyntilith. Will and Horace took half an hour or so to get set up the campsite. There was little to do. They attached their trampoline to some scrubby bushes growing out of the stone wall of the gully, weighing down the other end with rocks. And at least there were plenty of them. This gave them a triangular shelter in case the rain set in again. They then prepared a fireplace in front of the shelter. Gillen had said no fires, but if they arrived back in the middle of the night and changed those orders, they might as well be ready. It took a considerably longer time to stack a supply of firewood. The only real source was the scrubby heather that covered the hillside. The roots and branches of the bush were tough and highly flammable. The two boys hacked out a reasonable supply, Horace using the small hatchet he carried in his pack, and Will his sax knife. Eventually, with all the housekeeping taken care of, they sat on either side of the empty fireplace, their backs leaning against rocks. Will spent a few minutes running his sharpening stone over the sax knife, restoring its razor's sharp edge. I really prefer camping in forest areas, Horace said, shifting his back for the 10th time against the unyielding rock behind him. Will grunted in reply, but Horace was bored and kept on talking, more for the sake of having something to do than because he really wanted to. After all, in a forest you have lots of firewood ready to her hand. "It just falls out of the trees for you. Not while you wait." "Not while you wait," Will disagreed. He too was talking more for the sake of it than anything else. "No, not while you wait. Usually it's already happened before you arrive," Horace said. "Plus, in a forest you've usually got pine needles or leaves on the ground, and that makes for a softer sleeping place. And there are logs and trees to sit on and lean against, and they have a lot fewer sharp edges than rocks." Again he wiggled his back to a temporary, more comfortable spot. He glanced up at Will, rather hoping that the apprentice ranger might disagree with him. Then they could argue to pass the time. Will, however, merely grunted again. He inspected the edge of his sax knife, slid the knife back into its scabbard, and lay back. Uncomfortable, he sat up again, under the knife belt, and draped it over his pack, along with his bow and quiver. Then he lay back, his head on a flat piece of stone. He closed his eyes. The sleepless night he had spent had left him drained and flat. Horace sighed to himself, then took out his sword and began honing its edge, quite unsuccessfully, as it was already razor sharp. But it was something to do. He roused away, glancing occasionally at Will to see if his friend was asleep. For a moment he thought he was, but then the smaller boy suddenly squirmed around, sat up, and reached for his cloak. Bundling it up, he put it on the flat stone he was using as a headrest, then lay back again. "You're right about forest," he said crankily. "Much more comfortable places to camp." Horace said nothing. He decided his sword was sharp enough and slid it back into its oiled leather scabbard, leaning the sheathed weapon against a rock face beside him. He watched Will again as he tried to find a comfortable spot. No matter how he twisted and squirmed, there was always a pebble or a piece of rock poking into his back or side. 5 or 10 minutes passed, and Horace finally said, "Want to practice or pass the time?" Will opened his eyes and considered the idea. Reluctantly, he admitted to himself that he was never going to get to sleep on this hard stony ground. Why not? He rummaged in his pack for his practice weapon, then joined Horace on the far side of the tent, where he was scraping a practice circle in the sandy gully floor. The two boys took up their positions, then at a nod from Horace they began. Will was improving, but Horace was definitely the master at this exercise. Will couldn't help admiring the speed and balance he showed as he wielded the weapon sword in a dazzling series of backhands, forehands, side cuts, and overhands. Furthermore, when he knew he had beaten